10 prehistoric civilizations that existed before history began. Number 10. Watson Break and Poverty Point. In the early 1990s, Joe Saunders, a regional archaeologist with the Louisiana Division of Archaeology, set out to test a fairly narrow question. He wanted to confirm that a set of earthen mounds called Poverty Point in the northeastern corner of the state was the oldest large-scale construction project in North America. The standard chronology of the time was confident about the answer before anyone asked the question. Monumental earthworks required farming. Farming required surplus. Surplus required time. Nothing built by hunter-gatherers was supposed to outrank a few scattered campfires. Then Saunders found Watson Break. 11 mounds joined by low ridges into a rough oval nearly 300 meters across sat on a stream terrace not far from where Poverty Point would eventually rise. Extensive coring and more than 24 radiocarbon dates, published by Saunders and an interdisciplinary team of colleagues in the journal Science in September of 1997, told a story the old chronology had no room for. Construction at Watson Break began around 3,500 years before the Common Era, with the largest mounds raised in stages by roughly 3,300 BC, and the site finally abandoned sometime after 3000 BC. Nearly 1,000 years before the first stones were raised at Stonehenge, and some 7 centuries before the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its builders were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers, moving with fish runs and hickory nut seasons along the Washita River, who organized enough labor over enough seasons to raise a complex of mounds more than 4 meters high using nothing but baskets and packed earth. No surplus grain financed it. No permanent city fed the workforce. No ruler's name was carved anywhere to take credit for it. The old rule, monuments come after farming, simply did not apply here, and no one had thought to check until Saunders did. What makes Watson Break more than an isolated anomaly is what happened roughly 2,000 years later, a short distance downriver, at Poverty Point itself. By the time construction there wound down around 1100 BC, the site covered more than 900 acres, 5 mounds, 6 concentric ridges shaped like a broken fan around a central plaza, raised through an estimated 5 million hours of labor that moved something on the order of 53 million cubic feet of earth. This was not a larger repeat of the same small experiment. It was an economy. Stone and raw material recovered at Poverty Point came from copper deposits near the Great Lakes, more than 1,300 kilometers to the north. From soapstone quarries in the Appalachian foothills of Alabama and Georgia. From chert sources in the Ohio and Tennessee river valleys. From quartz crystal in the Ozark Highlands. Individual pieces traveled up to roughly 1,300 kilometers to reach the site, carried by canoe and by foot, exchanged hand-to-hand across a network with no wheels, no draft animals, and no writing to record who owed what to whom. The old rule about monuments needing farms first didn't just bend at Poverty Point, it broke completely. Every one of those exchanges, every one of those million labor hours, was coordinated by people the textbooks once filed under simple. The settlement and burial record shows no obvious palace, no elite tomb standing apart from the rest, no dynasty whose name survived to take the credit. What it shows instead is coordination on a scale usually associated with centralized authority, achieved by a trade network spanning roughly a third of the modern continental United States, managed by people who left no ledgers, no laws, and no name for themselves that anyone today can read. 2 mound-building peoples, 2,000 years apart, on the same river system, both broke a rule modern archaeology only wrote down after the fact. Watson Break and Poverty Point did not need agriculture to organize labor at a monumental scale. The next builders on this list did not need monuments at all. They organized something harder to leave in the ground, a working medical procedure precise enough to cut into living bone. Number 9. Aşıklı Höyük. Somewhere in the Melendez River Valley of central Anatolia, roughly 9,500 years ago, a 25-year-old woman lay still while someone cut into her scalp and began grinding a hole through the bone beneath it. She had no anesthetic beyond whatever plants, pressure, or shock dulled the pain. She had no metal instrument. What she had was a practitioner who had done this, or watched it done, often enough to know where to cut, how deep to go, and when to stop before the blade reached the membrane protecting her brain. When archaeologists later recovered and reconstructed her skull, the edges of the wound showed something remarkable: healing. She survived the operation, at least for a time, a detail that turns one skeleton into evidence of an actual medical tradition, not a single desperate accident. The procedure is called trepanation, and this skull is among the earliest confirmed examples of cranial surgery yet identified anywhere on Earth. The woman lived and was eventually buried at Aşıklı Höyük, a site excavated since 1989 under Mihraban Özbaşaran of Istanbul University. The first houses there went up around 8,400 years before the Common Era. People kept building on the same low mound, generation after generation, for roughly 1,000 years. At least 20 generations raising families, burying their dead, and rebuilding walls on the exact footprint their grandparents had used, until the mound itself grew from nothing but accumulated mud brick and human persistence. The site is small by later standards, barely 4 hectares, but the density tells its own story. More than 400 separate architectural units have been excavated so far. The earliest a scatter of semi-subterranean oval huts, later replaced by rectangular mud brick houses packed wall to wall into distinct neighborhoods. This was not a scattering of shelters used by whoever happened to be passing through. It was a fixed address, held by the same community, generation after generation, in what researchers describe as one of the first true villages anywhere in central Anatolia. Not every family fared equally well inside it. Of the roughly 70 skeletons recovered so far, a small fraction of the population that must have lived and died across 1,000 years of continuous occupation, a pattern emerges in the ages at death. Men at Aşıklı Höyük frequently lived into their 50s. Women, disproportionately, died in their 20s and 30s. The gap is wide enough and consistent enough across the burials to point towards something systemic: repeated pregnancy risk, harder physical labor, or some other burden distributed unevenly by sex, embedded into daily life long before anyone wrote a law, a medical text, or a complaint about it. What Aşıklı Höyük forces into the record is not a monument. It is a population with its own risks, its own inequalities, and, remarkably, its own surgeons. The woman with the healed hole in her skull did not carve a temple or raise an earthwork visible from orbit. She survived an operation that modern researchers studying trepanation still find difficult to explain in terms of precise prior knowledge, inside a community with no writing to record how the technique was taught, learned, or passed down. Somewhere in that 1,000-year mound, an oral tradition of surgery existed, was carried hand-to-hand for generations, and vanished completely the moment no one alive still remembered it. A skill can die with the last person who holds it. Whether an entire society is remembered at all, it turns out, can depend on something just as fragile: whether anyone else happened to write its name down first. Number 8. Dilmun. Long before archaeology confirmed a single stone of it, Dilmun already existed, on clay. The Sumerians who composed the Epic of Gilgamesh described it as a paradise beyond the eastern waters, the land where the gods granted eternal life to Utnapishtim, survivor of the Great Flood, where the sun itself was said to rise clean. For most of the 20th century, that was essentially all Dilmun was: a beautiful line in someone else's epic, filed by most scholars alongside other lands whose only known address was mythology. Then, beginning in the early 1950s, a Danish expedition led by archaeologist Geoffrey Bibby, working on behalf of the Prehistoric Museum of Moisgård, started digging on the island of Bahrain. What they found beneath the modern fortress of Khalat al-Bahrain was not a metaphor. It was a real Bronze Age port, its layers running deep under later Portuguese and Islamic construction, packed with imported seals and calibrated weights matching trading standards from Ur in southern Mesopotamia and from cities of the Indus Valley more than 1,500 kilometers to the east. Not a legend, not a folk memory, a functioning customs house sitting exactly where a foreign epic said a paradise would be. Nearby, Bibi's team also uncovered the Barbar Temple, built around a sacred spring dedicated to Enki, the Mesopotamian god of fresh water and wisdom, the same god whose own mythology placed Dilmun at the center of creation. Scattered across the western part of the island, archaeologists eventually cataloged more than 11,700 burial mounds, raised across roughly 3 centuries between about 2050 and 1750 BC, dense enough in places to resemble a landscape more than a cemetery. In 2019, 6 of those mound fields were formally inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognition that arrived only after a century of assuming the whole civilization might be invented. The mainstream reconstruction holds that Dilmun's core lay on Bahrain itself, anchored by the port and its temple. Other researchers argue its territory shifted across the centuries, extending north to the island of Failaka or along stretches of the eastern Arabian coast, depending on trade routes and political fortune. A minority position questions whether Dilmun ever named one fixed state at all, rather than a title attached to whichever port controlled the Gulf trade route in a given century. What no one now disputes is the fact a Danish team confirmed with a shovel. A real, prosperous, strategically vital trading civilization once sat exactly where a foreign poem said a paradise would be. A civilization, it turns out, can be entirely real and still needs someone else's paperwork to prove it. That is what makes Dilmun genuinely useful for understanding everything else on this list. Dilmun did not write its own surviving history. No Dilmunite chronicle, king list, or literary epic has been recovered in a script we can read as belonging to Dilmun itself. Everything textual we possess about its gods, its wealth, and its reputation was written by someone else, in Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform, for Sumerian and Akkadian readers. Dilmun survived into recorded history only as a guest in somebody else's book. That is not a flaw specific to one small Gulf trading state. It is the condition nearly every entry on this list shares, minus the lucky accident of a literate neighbor willing to write their name down. Dilmun got mentioned, most of what follows did not, and had to wait instead for a very different kind of accident: a construction crew, a dam survey, or a farmer's plow catching on something that was never supposed to surface again. Number 7. Boncuklu Tarla. In 2008, a routine archaeological survey ahead of construction on the İlısu Dam in Turkey's Mardin province flagged an unremarkable rise of ground near the village of İlısu for further investigation. Salvage archaeology projects like this one exist to do exactly one job before a reservoir permanently seals a landscape underwater: record what is there, remove what can be saved, and accept that everything else will be lost the moment the floodgates close. Nobody expected the site to still be delivering major discoveries more than a decade later. Since full excavations began in 2012, led by a team working from the Mardin Museum, Boncuklu Tarla has done exactly that, year after year. The name translates roughly to beaded field, and the site has more than earned it. Excavators have recovered upward of 200,000 individual beads, worked from stone, shell, and bone, scattered through a settlement occupied in phases from the late Epipaleolithic through the pre-pottery Neolithic B period. A span of roughly 4,000 years, beginning approximately 11,000 years before the Common Era. More than 200 human skeletons have been recovered from graves across the site. In 2019, excavators reported a large communal building reinforced with stone pillars, a structure serious enough that comparisons to a far more famous site 40 kilometers to the north became immediate and inevitable. That famous neighbor is Göbekli Tepe, the hilltop sanctuary whose isolated, purpose-built enclosures reshaped how archaeologists think about ritual architecture at the dawn of the Neolithic. Boncuklu Tarla is not a repeat of that discovery. It is closer to a correction of it. Göbekli Tepe, as excavated, shows little evidence of permanent domestic occupation, no clear households living day to day among its pillars. Boncuklu Tarla shows the opposite, ordinary houses standing directly alongside its temple structures in the same neighborhoods used by the same families generation after generation. Not an occasional shrine, not a hilltop retreat visited by scattered bands, a neighborhood with its sacred buildings built directly into the middle of it. A minority of researchers has pushed the implications further, arguing that Boncuklu Tarla's earliest layers may predate Göbekli Tepe's construction by close to 1,000 years, which would mean the entire tradition of raising T-shaped pillars and communal ritual buildings in this region began not at the famous site, but at the unremarkable one that almost went under a reservoir unnoticed. That claim remains contested. Dating a settlement occupied continuously across 4 millennia is a genuinely difficult problem, and the mainstream chronology still treats the two sites as close contemporaries, rather than assigning firm priority to either. One fact about Boncuklu Tarla outweighs the beads, the burials, and the dating argument combined. It exists in the archaeological record today for a single reason. A hydroelectric project needed to know what it was about to flood. The same government engineering program that commissioned that 2008 survey had, 16 years earlier and a short distance away, already finished flooding a different Neolithic sanctuary without ever fully understanding what it contained. That earlier site was excavated first, understood too late, and is, at this moment, still sitting underwater. Its story comes later on this list. But first, a settlement that survived by doing something Boncuklu Tarla's builders never had the chance to, writing nothing down, and getting mentioned anyway by someone else entirely. Number 6. Mehrgarh. Somewhere in the foothills of Baluchistan, in what is now Pakistan, roughly 9,000 years ago, an adult patient sat still while a practitioner pressed a flint-tipped bow drill against the chewing surface of a molar. The bow was drawn back and forth, spinning the point rapidly against the enamel. Researchers who have reproduced the technique experimentally describe the process as slow, effortful, and almost certainly painful for the person on the receiving end, who had no anesthetic beyond whatever their community understood about pain and patience. This did not happen once. In 2006, bioarchaeologist Andrea Kappa and colleagues published findings in the journal Nature describing 11 separate drilled molar crowns recovered from 9 adults in a Neolithic graveyard at Mehrgarh, dated to between roughly 9,000 and 7,500 years ago, pushing the earliest confirmed evidence of dental intervention back more than 1,500 years beyond anything previously documented. Concentric ridges left inside several of the holes match the rotational wear pattern of a bow drill precisely. 4 of the drilled teeth showed cavities positioned exactly where the holes had been cut, suggesting at least some of these procedures were not symbolic or decorative. They were therapeutic. Someone, across multiple patients, understood that a rotting tooth could sometimes be treated by drilling it out. Mehrgarh itself was identified in 1974 by the French archaeological mission under Jean-François Jarige and Catherine Jarige, who excavated the site across 2 major campaigns running into the year 2000. What they uncovered was not a temporary camp, but a true settlement, freestanding multi-room mud brick houses, storage granaries, and cultural deposits piling up across more than 11 meters of accumulated debris, spread over an area now estimated at roughly 200 hectares. This was farming life, established early and sustained for millennia at the western edge of what would eventually become the Indus Valley tradition. For decades, the word early carried one specific number. Jericho's original chronology placed Mehrgarh's earliest occupation at approximately 8,000 years before the Common Era, a date repeated in textbook after textbook as the opening line of South Asian farming. Then, in 2025, an international team applying refined radiocarbon dating to tooth enamel recovered from 23 Neolithic graves returned a markedly different answer, a start date closer to 5,200 years before the Common Era, nearly 3,000 years later than the figure generations of students had memorized. The revision does not erase Mehrgarh's importance. It still marks, by a wide margin, the earliest known farming settlement in the Indian subcontinent. It is, instead, a reminder that even a site excavated across 3 decades with a name recognized worldwide can have its most basic fact quietly rewritten by a single tooth enamel study less than a year before this was written. What Mehrgarh actually proves has little to do with the exact year. It proves that a farming community, thousands of years before anyone in the region wrote a word down, had already organized something closer to a medical practice than a folk remedy. Repeatable, technique-based, passed carefully enough from practitioner to practitioner that 11 separate patients received functionally the same procedure. Villages with granaries are common enough in the archaeological record. A village with dentists is a different kind of claim entirely, one written not on a tablet, but directly into the teeth of the people who lived it. Precision like that once was carved into stone as well as bone. The next site on this list proves it, and then shows exactly how completely precision can still be erased given the right kind of modern engineering. Number 5. Nevalı Çori. For 8 ordinary excavation seasons from 1983 to 1991, a team from the University of Heidelberg, led by archaeologist Harald Hauptmann, worked a low mound above the Euphrates River in what is now Şanlıurfa province, Turkey. They uncovered houses. They uncovered a semi-subterranean communal building set apart from the domestic structures, its walls lined with T-shaped limestone pillars standing up to 3 meters tall, several carved with human arms, hands, and stylized animal figures reaching across the stone. In the same building, they recovered what the excavation team has described as the oldest known life-size sculpture of the human form anywhere in the world. Season after season, the picture grew clearer. A sophisticated ritual tradition, older than agriculture in the region had any right to be, carved by people who had not yet invented pottery. Then, in 1992, the Ataturk Dam finished filling its reservoir, and Nevalı Çori went under the water and stayed there. The flooding was not a surprise, an accident, or an act of negligence. It was the intended outcome of a hydroelectric project years in the making, and Hauptmann's team had raced against exactly that deadline for the better part of a decade, recording and removing what could be moved before the rising water sealed the rest away for good. What fit in a truck survived. The carved pillars now on display in Şanlıurfa's museums, the excavation notes, the photographs. What did not stayed exactly where it was built and is, this year, entering its 4th decade underwater. What gives Nevalı Çori its real weight on this list is not the pillars themselves, remarkable as they are. It is timing. The T-pillar tradition documented here, carved limestone posts arranged in circles incorporating human and animal forms, was recorded and published years before a similar, far larger tradition was recognized at a hilltop sanctuary to the southeast that would eventually make headlines around the world. Nevalı Çori's pillars were part of what taught archaeologists to recognize what they were looking at when that bigger site was finally excavated in earnest. The sister site that helped explain the more famous discovery is the one now sitting in the dark, under many meters of reservoir water, unrecoverable in any practical sense, even though every serious account of monumental architecture's origins in the Near East now has to mention it. No one disputes any of this. There is no minority position, no competing school of thought, no ongoing argument to summarize, because the facts were never in question. The site existed, it was excavated, and then it was deliberately, permanently submerged by a piece of infrastructure that still generates electricity today. The Ataturk Dam was, by every engineering measure, a successful project. It was filed, approved, and completed on schedule. The carved heads and reaching hands beneath its reservoir were simply not part of any calculation that mattered enough to change the outcome. 10,000 years of erosion, war, and neglect had failed to erase what Nevalı Çori's builders raised. A single dam-filling season in 1992 finished the job in months. Somewhere beneath the still surface of the Ataturk Reservoir, T-shaped pillars with carved hands and arms continue to stand exactly where Hauptmann's team left them, facing a ceiling of dark water instead of a ceiling of Anatolian sky, unlit and unvisited, in the one kind of darkness that 10,000 years of open air had never quite managed to provide. Number 4. Jericho. The name carries more inherited assumption than almost any other site on this list. Most people who have heard of Jericho know it from a story about walls falling to trumpets and shouting, a Bronze Age siege narrative set roughly 3,500 years ago. The tower actually standing in the ground at Tel es Sultan predates that story and the walls it belonged to by well over 4,000 years. Excavations led by British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon between 1952 and 1958 exposed a massive stone wall and, built directly against it, a round stone tower nearly 8.5 meters tall, roughly 9 meters in diameter at its base, narrowing to about 7 meters at the top, with walls some 1.5 meters thick and an internal staircase climbing through the core. Radiocarbon dating places its construction in the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, somewhere close to 8,300 to 8,000 years before the Common Era. There was no pottery anywhere in the region when this tower went up. No metal tools, no wheel, no writing anywhere on Earth that any human alive today can read. And yet here stood a freestanding stone tower, engineered with a working internal staircase, inside a settlement that covered perhaps 2.5 hectares and may have housed only a few hundred people. Kenyon's original interpretation was straightforward. The tower and wall were defensive fortifications built to protect a food-secure settlement from raiders drawn by its stores. It was a satisfyingly simple answer. Simple answers about a 10,000-year-old tower rarely survive contact with more evidence for very long. Later researchers, applying archaeoastronomical modeling to the tower's position, propose that its placement aligns with the setting sun at the summer solstice against a nearby mountain, an alignment that would make the tower less a garrison post and more a communal marker of the calendar, tracking the turn of the farming year for a population just beginning to depend on seasonal harvests. A third, minority position, reads the entire structure as a prestige project, built less for defense or astronomy than to demonstrate that this particular community could organize labor no neighboring group could match. None of the three readings has managed to eliminate the other two. Subsequent fieldwork, including a long-running Italian-Palestinian excavation campaign that resumed work at the Tell through the 2010s, has refined the radiocarbon chronology without settling the argument over purpose, in part because the tower carries no inscription, no burial marking its builder, and no surviving myth from the culture that raised it to explain, in their own words, what problem they thought they were solving. What is not in dispute is the achievement itself. An estimated 100 working days of coordinated labor by some construction estimates went into a single tower raised by people with no pottery to store grain in, no metal to shape the stone with, and no writing system to leave instructions for the next builder. They organized anyway. They built something that still stands in some form 10,000 years later, long enough to outlast the empire, the language, and the entire cultural memory of the people who built it, and still be standing, stubbornly, underneath a story about its walls falling down that would not be written for another 6,000 years. Jericho's builders left behind an anonymous achievement, a tower with no name attached to a single one of its architects. 1,500 kilometers to the northwest, a very different kind of builder was about to do something almost no one this early in the record had dared to attempt: carve a face. Number 3. Karahan Tepe. In 2020, a team working under Necmi Karul of Istanbul University, part of Turkey's wider Taş Tepeler, Stone Hills research initiative, cleared soil away from a rock-cut chamber roughly 37 kilometers southeast of the sanctuary at Göbekli Tepe. What emerged from the chamber wall was a carved human head, bearded, with a defined nasal bridge, hollowed eye sockets, and a distinct jawline, its neck rendered as a long, serpentine curve running along the chamber floor. Arranged in a rough semicircle around the room stood a set of pillars, several carved with explicit phallic imagery, facing the head as though positioned in deliberate relationship to it. Karahan Tepe, dated to approximately 9,400 BC, has produced 266 T-shaped megaliths so far, some standing over 3 meters tall, including one left unfinished, still partly fused to the bedrock its carvers never separated it from, a frozen record of labor interrupted for reasons no one recorded. Then, in September of 2023, excavators working a newly opened enclosure at the top of the site's hill uncovered 2 further statues, unlike anything previously catalogued there: a carved vulture and a 2.3-meter anthropomorphic figure of a man seated upright on a carved stone bench, gripping his own genitals with both hands, his ribs and finger joints picked out in careful, incised detail. Researchers working on the find have described it as among the earliest known large-scale, individually rendered depictions of the human body anywhere in the archaeological record. That last distinction matters more than the statue's size. Göbekli Tepe's T-pillars, 40 kilometers away, are best known for abstract and animal imagery: foxes, boars, vultures, scorpions, carved in relief across monumental but comparatively impersonal stone posts. What Karahan Tepe adds to that tradition is something categorically different: a specific body, seated, individualized, its anatomy rendered in a level of detail that reads less like a symbol and more like an attempt at portraiture. Roughly 11,400 years ago, someone at this site decided that the human figure itself, shown as a particular body rather than an abstract sign, deserved to be carved into permanent stone. No one currently knows who that figure represents: an ancestor, a specific status, a mythic founder, or something with no equivalent in any tradition that survived into writing. The mainstream reading treats the seated figure and the bearded head as related expressions of an ancestor-focused belief system, tying communal ritual space directly to remembered or invented human forebears. A competing interpretation reads the same imagery as evidence of a fertility-centered tradition distinct from, and possibly older than, whatever Göbekli Tepe represents. A smaller minority view resists both readings, arguing the figures may record specific, once-famous individuals whose stories simply never survived in any form we can recognize today. All three agree on the detail that matters most. A society this old had already decided that a specific human likeness belonged carved in stone, at monumental scale, at the ritual center of their community. Taş Tepeler is not a finished excavation. It is a live, government-funded research program spanning 12 mounds across the region, several barely tested, with new enclosures still being opened within the last few years. Karahan Tepe's seated man was not sitting in a museum case waiting to be catalogued. He was still in the ground, unknown to anyone alive, as recently as 2023. Which means the next entry in a countdown like this one is never entirely hypothetical. It is whatever the current excavation season happens to turn up next. One carved man can rewrite what a single sanctuary means. What happens when an entire city's worth of ordinary people vanish from the record instead, leaving nothing behind but the ash of their own homes, burned on purpose, again and again, for reasons still argued about today? Number 2. The Trypillia megasites. At its peak, sometime between 3700 and 3500 BC, the settlement of Talyanki in what is now central Ukraine covered approximately 450 hectares, roughly the footprint of 600 modern soccer pitches laid edge to edge across open steppe. Researchers modeling the site's occupation have proposed peak population estimates as high as 14 to 15,000 people, all living inside a single, continuously inhabited settlement, without a king whose name survives, without a temple complex dominating its layout, and without a single line of writing to explain how any of it was organized. A second megasite, Majdanetske, may have held close to 3,000 houses, with population models ranging as high as the high 20,000s depending on method. An uncertainty that is itself revealing, since no comparable argument exists over the population of Bronze Age Uruk, a city whose scale can be checked against its own written records. That comparison is not incidental. Some researchers studying the Cucuteni Trypillia culture have explicitly proposed that these megasites represent societies operating at a level of organizational complexity comparable to early Uruk, the settlement most textbooks still credit as humanity's first true city. The claim remains contested. What is not contested is the agricultural machine that made settlements this size possible at all. A 2023 isotope study led by researchers including Frank Schlutz and Johannes Müller of Kiel University, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, analyzed bone and plant chemistry from Trypillia sites and confirmed that populations of this scale were fed through intensively managed cattle pasturing, with manure deliberately collected and applied to fuel large-scale pulse and cereal cultivation. Not opportunistic farming stretched to its limit. A coordinated agricultural system, engineered specifically to sustain tens of thousands of people. Every 60 to 80 years or so, roughly once or twice within a single long human lifetime, these societies did something that still has no fully accepted explanation. They burned their own towns to the ground. Full-scale reconstructions built specifically to test the process have confirmed the fires were set deliberately, not accidentally, consuming hundreds of standardized houses in coordinated community-wide events before the population rebuilt on the same site or relocated to found a new one. The competing theories multiply the deeper researchers dig. Some read the burning as a communal funerary rite, cremating a house along with its dead. Others, following early 20th century archaeologist Evgeny Krichevsky, argue it was practical, a way to sterilize timber and clay structures against rot, mold, and pests before rebuilding. Still others propose warfare, ritual renewal tied to the agricultural calendar, or simple space clearing, explanations that sit at outright odds with one another. No excavation has yet produced the evidence that would close the argument. What ties the mystery back to everything else on this list is a single observation. Researchers, including Johannes Müller, have argued that Trypillia's lack of writing may have been more than an omission. It may have actively limited how these societies could adapt once conflict, resource strain, or coordination failures began to strain a population in the tens of thousands. A city-scale society, sustained by an engineered agricultural surplus large enough to rival Sumer's, still could not write down a grievance, a debt, or a warning. Somewhere in that gap between scale and script, the Trypillia megasites eventually declined and were abandoned, leaving burned foundations, scattered bone, and vast open fields where a city once stood, with no name for archaeologists to call it besides the one borrowed from a Ukrainian village sitting on top of the buried town. 15,000 people, and not one of their names survived. One grave in the next and final entry held so much wealth that a single name would have been almost beside the point. Number 1. The Varna necropolis and the invention of inequality. Picture the summer of 1972 on the outskirts of the Bulgarian city of Varna, where a mechanical excavator digging a routine cable trench struck something that stopped the work crew cold. Human bone, and beside it, the unmistakable dull shine of worked gold. What began as a utility job became, over the following 2 decades, one of the most consequential excavations in European prehistory, directed first by Mikhail Lazarov and then, from 1972 to 1991, by archaeologist Ivan Ivanov. By the time the count was finished, the Varna necropolis had produced more than 300 graves, over 22,000 individual objects, and more than 3,000 gold artifacts weighing a combined 6 kilograms. That figure, on its own, undersells what it means. The gold recovered from this one Bulgarian cemetery exceeds, by several times, the combined weight and number of every other gold artifact recovered from anywhere else on Earth dating to the same broad era, Egypt and Mesopotamia included. Radiocarbon analysis has placed the richest burials at approximately 4600 to 4200 BC, more than 1,000 years before the first stone of the Great Pyramid was cut, and nearly 2,000 years before Sumerian scribes pressed the first wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. One grave made the point unmistakably. Grave 43, uncovered in 1974, belonged to a man laid out with a gold-sheathed axe, gold ornaments sewn across his clothing, and a scepter, a carved symbol of authority, resting beside him. That single burial contained more gold than any other single site on the planet had yet produced from the same period. He was not alone in his distinction. Across the wider cemetery, just 3 graves together account for more than half of all the gold weight found at Varna, and each of those 3, like grave 43, held a scepter. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the same necropolis, other graves held only a handful of ordinary pottery, or nothing that survived at all. Analysis of the gold objects themselves adds a detail that turns wealth into administration. Researchers studying the weight and form of Varna's gold beads and ornaments identified evidence of standardization, artifacts clustering around at least 2 minimal weight units, close to 0.14 grams and 0.40 grams respectively, consistent with regulated, centrally controlled production rather than casual individual craftsmanship. Someone in this community was not simply hoarding gold. Someone was enforcing consistency into it, precisely enough that 6,000-year-old beads still measure out in matching units today. Not a myth. Not a king's name carved somewhere for later historians to translate. A grave, a scepter, and a weight system enforced by people who left no writing to explain why they enforced it, or what happened to anyone who broke it. Organized social hierarchy, inherited or accumulated wealth, centralized symbolic authority, a production system precise enough to regulate itself, existed in Europe more than a millennium before the first pharaoh and nearly 2 millennia before the first legible sentence. Grave 43 did not wait for civilization, in the textbook sense, to arrive before inventing one of its oldest and least comfortable features. You exist in a species that organized inequality before it organized an alphabet. The distance between those 2 achievements is not a footnote to civilization. For most of human history, it was civilization, minus the part that happened to survive in a form anyone since has learned to read. Consider the implications seriously because it applies to every entry on this list, not only to Varna. If a mud brick village in central Anatolia had not sat beside a reservoir engineers eventually needed to survey, if a Bulgarian utility crew in 1972 had dug 3 meters to the left, if Kathleen Kenyon had chosen a different tell to excavate in 1952, or a Danish team had never sailed to Bahrain, or the Ataturk Dam had filled a different valley, most of what fills this list would still be sitting in the ground today, unnamed, unread, and, by the only definition most people still reach for without thinking, simply prehistoric. Not because the people who built it were simple, because nothing about them happened to survive in a form anyone since has learned to read. History did not begin with Sumer, or with any single alphabet, temple, or king list. It began, arbitrarily, wherever the evidence happened to survive. A peat bog, a dry cave, a burial a farmer's plow never quite reached, a dam project that flooded one sanctuary and, a few kilometers upstream, merely exposed another. Everything on the far side of that line did not stop being complex, organized, or human the moment the record goes quiet. It only stopped being written down. And the ground, unlike any archive built on purpose to hold a memory, has never once promised to keep anything safe. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.